I'm Nathan Ripley, and this is the story behind my stories.
You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Dr. O,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Hobb,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Charlene Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Nathan Ripley.
Thank you so much for tuning in to Author Stories. We really appreciate you listening. If you would like to subscribe to the show, over in the right-hand sidebar, there are some handy links where you can click and subscribe on your iPhone or your Google Android device, or listen online, or YouTube, or Stitcher Radio. Pretty much anywhere that you listen to podcasts, you can subscribe to Author Stories there. We would like to thank our sponsors today for sponsoring the show. It's because of their generous support that we're able to bring you so many great author interviews, and we'll be calling out those sponsors throughout the show. So thank you to them. As always, stay tuned at the end of the show for an audiobook clip from our good friend Richard Gleaves. Thank you so much for listening. Now on to our show. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Nathan Ripley on the show with me today. Nathan has a fantastically mind-bending new book called Find You in the Dark, and when you're listening to this, it will be on sale today here in the U.S., where I'm recording this. So I think you guys are really going to love this book. Welcome to the show, Nathan.
Hey, looking forward to talking, Hank.
But we begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Oh, wow. Geez, I wish I had a great Stand By Me like story here. I think I did have some envy for my sister, who was like a really good natural storyteller when we were kids, and who also had a work ethic, which I completely lacked. So I think it was probably reading some of her early stories and wanting to do that thing. She was 6 years older than me or so. So yeah, I think it came out of envy.
I love that. Envy will carry you a long way. But if you don't have that writer gene or that storytelling gene inside you, the mimicking eventually wears off. At what point did you realize that this was more than something that you just envied in your sister, but this was something that was ingrained in you as well?
Yeah, I think, there's that whole like Harold Bloom anxiety of influence. You start off just imitating, not just in your family, but the writers you admire.
Right.
I think it was as I became much more serious about my reading for entertainment and for, edification, that I decided, if I want to actually get good at this, I have to really, find what the things I have to say are that are important, as well as what the ideas that I find compelling are, and try to start building some skills to be able to communicate them.
Was this something that you pursued through school? Were there teachers that recognized a gift and encouraged you, or anything like that?
I think in high school I had English teachers who said that I was a good writer, but I never really pursued any creative schooling. I did English lit degrees, so I took that really seriously. I really wanted to be, good at writing essays, a good interpreter of literature, and a great reader. But I think probably because of the way that I came up as a reader, reading a lot of mid-century American high literary fiction and also pulp fiction, I never was really attracted by the idea of doing a BFA or an MFA.
Right.
I wanted to do it myself, which I think is actually, kind of stupid, because so many great, super original writers come out of MFA programs. But I didn't want to do that. Yeah. Basically.
Well, and probably an equal number of folks get an MFA and never do anything with it. The education in itself does not guarantee that you'll do anything especially creative or groundbreaking. So it's kind of that, that argument of to MFA or not. Is it better to get life experience and then report on that in your writing, or is it better, to get the arts degree? Does one do more or less than the rest? And I guess that's an argument that every person is going to come to differently.
Yeah, and I think what just a more general liberal arts education will give you that an MFA or a BFA might not, is that you end up reading a lot that you might not otherwise have been drawn to yourself.
Right.
And you have these discussions that sort of drive that, but I'm certainly not anti-MFA. I'd say my one beef with MFA programs is they, for some reason, if you get a master's in English, they teach you research methods, like how to build a paper, how to write a book review, how to sort of start your career. And I find that it's odd that in MFAs they don't tell you about how, this is how you start your podcast, or this is how you start pitching nonfiction articles. This is how you start making a living in order to support yourself as a writer.
Right.
I always found that puzzling.
Yeah, for sure. Another thing you're not going to get in an MFA, and I'm like you, I'm not anti-MFA at all. I actually find it really interesting, the people that get something out of it versus the people that don't, or it's just one of those things that I think people are going to eventually be what they're going to be, and the tools you collect along the way may speed that up or help or what. But I find it fascinating. But one thing you're not going to get in MFA is much love for pulp fiction, and you mentioned that you had this great mix of earlier American high literature and pulp fiction. What is it about pulp that really grabbed your attention?
Oh, I mean, it was, as you've been saying here earlier, it's story. Like, I was just so arrested by story from, again, this actually wasn't envy this time, but something forbidden. My parents would refuse to let me watch Conan the Barbarian, even though I was an enormous Arnold Schwarzenegger fan as a kid. Because my father's secretary had said, never let your children watch this. It's violent garbage, which is like, well, for one thing, that is my favorite genre of movie. So I needed to see this, but they refused. So I picked up some Robert E. Howard paperbacks. My parents let me read anything I wanted to. There was restrictions on what I could watch, but not on what I could read. And then, like, once you discover that and you go to Edgar Rice Burroughs and then, Raymond Chandler and Hammett, it's all over. And then eventually that built into me getting attracted to writers like Patricia Highsmith, who, if you're talking about American high literature and you're talking about American pulp fiction, you can't put her in either camp. She's too good for either of them. And I began to realize, almost everything that attracts me about the stories I want to tell her here is found in this weird middle section of what I use pulp fiction because I know it's a pejorative term to some people. To me, like, it has this great historical grounding. Like, that's where inventiveness came from in the kind of popular culture that I care about most is that enormous appetite for popular stories in the early 20th century.
Well, pejorative to some, but pulp has become one of those terms, a little bit like geek and nerd culture have. When I was a kid in the 70s and 80s, if you were called a geek, that was an insult. That was not something to be proud of. And now we have whole conventions, with tens of thousands of people that are built upon nerd and geek culture, and pulp is one of those terms that has been embraced by people that love genre fiction. And usually genre fiction means something that's very plot driven and gets you excited and is a page turner, and it doesn't require you to sit and ruminate on a page at a time before it's something that's plot driven, and there's nothing wrong with that, and I think there's a real disservice when we start drawing lines between genre fiction and high literature, and it's almost like we're saying that if you have deep character studies, you can't have much of a plot, or if you have a page-turning plot, then your characters can't be very well drawn. And as we see in your book specifically, but in a growing number of books out there that are really taking genre fiction and kind of turning it inside out, is you can absolutely do both.
Yeah, and I think that's so important. And I mean, it's also something I realized early. And I started, by the way, my other name is Naben Ruthnam. That's the other name I write under. I write nonfiction and quote-unquote literary fiction too. But I realized, pretty early on that the things that I was any good at and the things that I liked doing were like, character-based, concept-based, plot-driven fiction. So even my literary fiction, it's not a world away from what I do when I'm writing as Nathan Ripley. I'd say if there's any difference at all, it's that I am aware that I'm writing an entertainment on some level when I'm writing as Nathan Ripley. I don't necessarily have that same pressure of entertaining when I'm writing as Naben Ruthnam. But I also, even as Naben though, I want to. I have this idea of a reader in my mind. Like I'm not just writing for myself. Like I'm exploring these ideas and these concepts and these characters, and it might be a little more meandering and a little less page turning, but ultimately I do still want to keep that reader engaged and fascinated, if not entertained. I think that the two types of writing really are just one type of writing with slightly different aims.
Yeah. And do you think that the culture that we're in and with the type of entertainment that we're inundated with it affects things like literary fiction, where someone said a while back that authors are not competing with each other. Really, what we're all competing against is YouTube and Netflix and Facebook and all of the things that pull at our attention. Do you think that reality that we're living in is affecting the types of books that are coming out? Do you think that literary fiction has to be more fast-paced or has to be more plot-driven now because of that?
That's interesting. I mean, I feel if you try to compete with the screen on a level of sheer pace and ability to capture somebody's attention passively, books are always going to lose. Like that can't be what we make the battlefields. So yeah, I would say I don't think that. Like I still find myself being absorbed by literary fiction that is meandering and not plot based or fast paced. But I mean, like everybody, it does take me a few minutes of just trying to lock my attention in and leaving my phone alone before I can really commit to reading something like that. And it's worth the reward. So I think what we need to do as readers and as writers is continually remind ourselves, like, there is a value here. Like, and it's not just it's something that you can't get from the screen. Is that sort of long conversation you have with a book, and I think you get that from pulp fiction too. I mean, even if you're not pausing after every page to sort of reflect, I've closed. You close a book like The Talented Mr. Ripley or The Far Cry by Frederick Brown, and you think about it for the rest of your life. Like, what does this mean? What kind of person am I? So even while you're being entertained, these questions come up that are ultimately unanswerable, I think.
Yeah. Well, we've kind of jumped ahead a little bit, but what was your? So you went to college and you worked on a literature degree. What was your first job in the industry?
Oh wow. Let's see. I mean, in terms of making money, I was always copywriting, whether it was social media or other kinds of advertising. And then I'd say like the first inroads I made toward making a few bucks here and there was writing short stories, and then eventually sort of literary journalism, like interviewing authors. But of course, I'm based in Canada, where we have the miracle of arts grants. So once you have a few publications, you can apply for an arts grant, and that'll pay for a couple months of living while you write, which is amazing. It's a great system. But
yeah, I'm thinking about coming to Canada. Sounds fantastic.
It's really good. So I think some writers become sort of overly reliant on them, and they become sort of a lottery that rules your career, which is not healthy. But certainly, like there's really a right way to use them, and I think it worked out for me. But I wrote a short story called Cinema Rex, and that won like a decent Canadian prize up here, and that's when I started to be both to take my career a little more seriously, and agents and publishers started to ask me a couple questions about what I was up to next.
Speaking of writing short stories, I am a huge fan of Ray Bradbury, and I read a lot of his stuff, and he gets categorized as science fiction, and actually in his body of work, very little of what he wrote was science fiction. Most of it was kind of literary, type short stories. But he was a huge proponent of writing short fiction, especially for authors that were just learning. His idea was that learning to complete something, to get a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and to keep repeating that process until you became good at it. That you could only write so many bad stories before you eventually got good. In writing short fiction, and now you've got other longer works out, obviously, in the new novel. But what was that difference like for you in writing short fiction as opposed to the stuff that you're writing now?
You're making me wonder if I actually learned this lesson from Ray Bradbury, whom I also love, because I know he used to write 1 or 2 a week, and
exactly.
That's how he got good. Yeah, that was a very conscious decision I made too. I wrote a bad novel in my early 20s, which I tried to have published a bit and actually got a bit of headway with agents, but it just wasn't good, and I knew it. And that's when I turned to writing short stories, and that rhythm of completing things, and then also being able to look back in 2 months and look at the story and be like, this is bad in the following ways, and I won't make these mistakes again. That's great. But when you're attacking that sprawling first draft of a novel, the first draft of Find You in the Dark, which is called Scrapbook at the time, that was my MFA. Like when I reached page 150 of it and realized, I have a ton of great character work in here, and I have about 5 pages worth of plot. So I need to do some real thinking about what goes where. And that actually shape the pattern for what my process is now, where I really don't put any shackles on at all for the first 100 odd pages, and then I back off in the manuscript, and at that point make some sort of at least mental outline. Have I gotten away from your question here?
No. That's perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. Before writing Find You in the Dark, you also published a memoir under Nathan Ripley.
Yeah.
What was that process like for you writing the memoir, and why did that feel important to you to do that?
That was a weird one. Luckily, I was able to approach that more as literary criticism, because I was talking about the kind of books that a person who looks like me is supposed to write, like a brown, South Asian origin person. You often find yourself pigeonholed either by expectations around you from, family members, which was not true in my case, or more, which was true in my case, the publishing industry. You're supposed to write, an immigrant fiction story, whether it's about refugees or about a born in Canada or America brown guy sort of not getting along with his parents, trying to fit in the West and the East, finding answers back home and on a trip to India. All these, there's these it's a genre in itself in literary fiction, is that kind of book. So I wanted to sort of tackle that and look at some authors that I really loved, and then figure out why it seemed more difficult for me to find acceptance for the particular stories that I wanted to tell. So that's where that came from. I talk about Ray Bradbury in the book. He has an anecdote about when he wrote his short story, The Lake, how he cried at the end because it was the first time he'd written something really great. And I certainly didn't cry, but when I finished my story, Cinema Rex, it was more that I felt sort of defeated. I was like, this is absolutely the best I can do. And, after, 5-6 years of submitting with no luck, if this story doesn't do something for my career, then I need to start thinking about doing something else. So it wasn't quite as hopeful and beautiful a moment as it was for Bradbury, but I loved like having that sort of that parallel. Like, it is a great feeling when you first realize this is actually something that I would read and think was good. That's a good moment in an author's career, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Do you feel like that memoir was a bridge of sorts for you that to allow you to do what you're doing now by kind of settling those questions of the expectations? Yeah,
that's a good point. Like, I didn't notice that before I was writing it, but while I was in the process, I was like, well, this is of course kind of what I'm doing. It's, in a weird way, it's sort of a manifesto saying that I'm going to write exactly what I want to write. And I sort of, thanks to my editor, Emily Keeler, we found a way to sort of talk about, why literature matters and why sort of the conversation around diversity can get pretty narrow. Like when we talk about wanting to hear more stories from X cultural group, sometimes that begins to mean like, let's keep on hearing this one kind of story from X cultural group. Like if it's a story from, say, like young gay men, let's hear a story of tragic love over and over again. Well, there's some young gay author in New York who's like, well, I have this other kind of story, this like science fiction fantasy concept I have that is also kind of a queer story. Is anybody interested? And he hears crickets because they want can you tell us a tragic love story instead? It's like, oh.
Right. Or the young gay man who is or a gay man who is in a loving relationship that is 30 years long and they've raised a family and they come home and watch football together.
Which is like fascinating, like an American nuclear family story that it happens to be a gay couple. Like, I want to read that book. Yeah.
Right. Oh man. So bring us to Find You in the Dark, because I really find it fascinating when talking about the memoir and that bridge of sorts that it was your manifesto, because you've written a book now that if this were a movie, your parents would not have let you watch this, by your own description earlier. What intrigues you and fascinates you about this particular genre and the types of stories about these extremely flawed people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I've loved horror before I loved crime fiction, and the thing that fascinates me about serial killer fiction, when it's good, which I think is actually kind of rare, is that it exists at this sort of borderline of criminal investigation, which is supposed to be organized and sane and light versus dark, and then like true monsters where we have this sort of horror concept built in. And then the other thing I wanted to explore in Find You in the Dark is a true crime obsession, which is not a recent phenomenon, but it has like these days it has sort of like an NPR gloss. Like it's okay to talk about being obsessed with murder or vanished people. It's become like water cooler conversation, whereas before it was kind of like a grimy paperback type conversation. So I wanted to like kind of explore all these borderlines of what makes a difference between like a very normal, well-adjusted person who's interested in crime and interested in terrible things that happen to people, whether it's out of that's just an interesting story, or they're answering psychological questions within themselves. And then I wanted to sort of turn the screws on that and think about, well, what if the person who's so fascinated in these stories has something wrong with them that they're trying to address through this sort of elevated true crime investigation, which is what my protagonist Martin Rees does. He's, as you know, he's buying old police files and looking for the undiscovered victims of serial killers. So I wanted to push that and sort of get readers into the mind of someone who thinks he's being just a pure good Samaritan, but really there's something a little off with him.
I think I heard somewhere from you that this book really began as a joke.
It began as a G-chat conversation. I can't remember where I said this, but it's true.
I don't remember where I heard it, but I do remember that. Yeah,
my friend Simon McNabb, who's a screenwriter now, we used to just fake pitch ideas at each other, and I sent him 3, 2 of which are totally ridiculous, and then one of which was the actual idea for Find You in the Dark. And I have to admit to myself, like, I wasn't joking. I was really trying to see what he thought of it, but I was just kind of too embarrassed to actually communicate to him. I think this is a good idea. And he immediately picked it out and was like, I've actually not seen that particular concept before. And that's a really crowded genre space. So that's probably something you should think about. Like, if you can get an original idea, you should maybe work on it. And yeah, so I did.
You know, I'll bet there's a lot of writers listening to this, and they probably have a folder on their computer or in a notebook somewhere full of ideas that have come to them, because ideas come to writers in the craziest times and places. But they probably have all these ideas that they've written down that they think are just off the wall and stupid. And this is your charge to go find those and to do something with them, because the ones that feel absurd a lot of times are the ones that really have something. Yeah, I mean, even though I don't write comedy, I find like that most of my most interesting ideas do come from jokes, or at least they come from the same brain territory as jokes, because in jokes you're sort of making two unexpected things collide often, which is also how a lot of great stories are generated. You know, like Carrie's, telekinesis meets bullied high school girl. That's where that idea comes from. And I feel like that's a very similar way to how you generate a good joke. Well, and another thing about a good joke is it needs to have a thread of truth to make it more biting and more funny. Something that's completely absurd is not funny, but something that is a little bit true is, that is what really resonates. And I think that probably the same kind of thing with story ideas. Yeah, and I think that's actually what makes my book's a good example of this. Like, that's whether you like the thread of truth or not, or whether I pull it off, it means a difference between a reader who likes the book and doesn't. When I was making the horrible error of reading Goodreads reviews of my book. Never do that. Yeah, it's not. Somebody told me, my friend Andrew Sullivan, I think, or no, it was actually Sarah Wyman, said that's a good place for readers, not for writers. You can. It's a good place for dreams to go die. Yes, I use it to like mark what books I've read and to give other people reviews, good reviews. But it's a dark zone. But I think a lot of people that my book doesn't work for are the ones who like they don't buy the family dynamics. They don't really like certain characters. I don't have like an unlikable character problem, but I'm more interested in interesting characters than likable characters, which I think is pretty common for it. But yeah, I think that's where the thread of truth in a book like this comes from, that holds it together, is whether the human dynamics of it work. So, yeah. Exactly. I have a very early release of this book because David at Atria is a complete rock star. And I've had it for a while. I read through the book. When I first got it, it's probably been a couple of months ago now. And so preparing to record this with you, I got the book back out, went back through it, and was surprised all over again by Martin Rees. And that is, it's beautiful when a book can do that, when something you've already read and you pick it up and you're mesmerized all over again by a character. Tell us about Martin Rees. And we know that the idea of the book came from this, joking, not joking, pitch to your friend. But the situation would be nothing without Martin Rees. So tell us about Martin and how he came to you. Well, with Martin, I wanted someone who was fooling himself and whose entire life depended on how effectively he could fool himself. So I knew he had to be both a really smart guy and someone who could be willfully blind. So Martin's he's a person who's built a family life, he built a career, but it was all to serve his hobby, which is the dark. It's a dark hobby, which is buying the police files and searching for these undiscovered victims. I think where the reader gets his first clues that there's something not totally pure about Martin is that his wife is actually the sister of a girl who vanished and is presumably the victim of a serial killer. And that's when we start to get into his head a bit. Like, we realize, wow, this is someone who took his fascination with murder
not to the point of actually ever hurting anybody, but to borderline following, maybe stalking the sister of this victim. But then also, in order to make the book work, and also to make my character interesting to me, I wanted him to really love his wife and daughter. I wanted that world to feel really real and lived in. Like, his family life is still a real life. I think often in a book like this, all the normalcy is a really transparent support system for the stuff that the writer's really interested in, like the crime horror stuff. That wouldn't work. Like, I'd have to be able to write a short story about just a day in Martin Rees's life that had nothing to do with any of this crazy murder stuff. So I had to be interested in him as a person, and I had to be really interested in his wife and his daughter and the detective that he eventually comes up against.
You mentioned earlier that you began, you had gotten about 100 pages in, I think, and realized that you had this great character study that then, with about 5 pages of plot, at what point, when you discovered that, how did you then go back and start working in the kind of details of what's going on in the book and starting to build out that plot?
Well, for one thing, I realized there's not enough people in this book. Like, the detective wasn't present in that draft, and his daughter wasn't present in that draft. So I was thinking to myself, there needs to be more people here pulling the strings, or else Martin has too many outs from this situation. So that's when I realized, like, oh, that's what a plot is. It's having enough events and people around to actually exert pressure upon the character and move the story along.
Gotcha. Because this genre is so popular now, people are really tuned in to how true crime investigations work, and the amount of stuff published in the genre kind of elevates, makes everyone elevate their game to keep good things coming out. As someone who doesn't work in criminal investigation and hopefully is not a serial killer, how do you go about getting that thread of credibility in the book that you have done so well, and keeping the tension racked up, as a writer who is not immersed in that world?
Well, thanks. I'm glad that it worked for you and you found it believable. I think I did just enough research. Like, to me, the story always has to come before the research, and it was more of a problem of I tried to eliminate as many issues before they could come up as possible. So Martin is someone who he really doesn't want to get caught when he's out on his digs. So, for example, he'll make sure that he leaves his phone behind, or that he goes to another site and he leaves his phone there, so he doesn't have that trackable GPS with him all the time. And then when it came to like DNA and stuff like that, I tried to make sure that the events in the book were happening in settings where Martin could kind of control the crime scene, and or like towards the end he could always find an excuse for why he might have left DNA at a certain place. Because these are the things that I think, crime writers, they really hem us in, the cell phones and the DNA.
Right.
But, people get away with crimes all the time. So,
Sure.
So if criminals can do it, writers can too.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned that balance between research and doing just enough, because sometimes you can over-research something to the point that it just becomes clinical, and then it's no fun.
Yeah.
And so balancing that character development and along with the actual details of it. Sometimes the details are not as important as building that mood and the character responses and all those sorts of things.
Yeah, and sometimes you can actually just make it a different kind of book. Like if you look at the cops in my book and then measure them up against the cops in a Don Winslow book, there's no question that Winslow's cops are amazingly more realistic. Like those are real cops in there. My book needs cops that are real enough, but it's mostly more important to have their relationships be real, their motivations be real, and maybe not like, chain of command procedural stuff be 100% accurate. I definitely want that stuff not to to break the reality of the story. But so it has to be real enough, but it doesn't need to be like, if a Seattle cop read this book, he might raise an eyebrow at some of the things that are done or not done by the cops, and that's fine by me. And I think it's actually probably fine by him too, fine by this fictional cop I invented, as long as he's reading and enjoying the story.
Yeah. Well, and you really want those characters to come in and out of the story kind of unhindered. You don't want to zero in on them so much that those details do become important. By keeping them sort of tertiary, you can not have to deal with all those details so much.
Yeah, and the important thing about the cop, Ellen, oh my God, I got my own character's name wrong. I'm sorry. The important thing about the cop, Detective Sandra Whittal, is that she is an obsessive, and she does have things in her background that are similar to Martin's. So it's more that parallel between the two of them. That's what I want readers to sort of fixate on. It's like, this character is almost a demonstration of somebody who is a different route that Martin could have gone and chose not to.
Do you feel like your life as a journalist has affected you as a fiction writer?
Because I was just a literary journalist, no. Like, I think if I was a crime reporter or something like that, it definitely would have. But I mean, I think actually the way it did was writing those early essays and interviews kind of demonstrated to me, like, oh, I do have a capacity to write nonfiction, which I never really thought I did. But it's become so much an important part of. I think this might be a place-to-place, genre-to-genre thing, but here in Toronto anyway, like, you kind of, if you want to have a short story collection out or a literary novel someday, a lot of people start off writing essays and personal essays, and those are the things that, generate clicks, get you published, get you noticed. I didn't want to do that, but I ended up doing it anyway. But I found that I enjoyed talking about other people's books, and that sort of led to my first book, Curry Eating, Reading, and Race. But I don't know if any of that had a direct effect on me as a novelist, me as a crime writer. So.
Well, what's interesting though is that I think a lot of people think that the path to publishing and to writing success is writing the novel that breaks out and finds a big audience. And the reality may be that someone is an essayist that then leads to this thing, which then leads to this thing, and then, or a short story writer that leads to being included in some anthologies that maybe leads to a collection that then leads to a novel. It's really the circuitous route, and that's what I love hearing from people, is that there is no one path to success, and success may even look differently to two different people. But it's being engaged with what comes your way and using those creative muscles any way you can find to.
Yeah, just for one thing, you got to sit down and do the work and do as much different kinds of work. But as you said, you also just have to look for that opportunity coming and be ready to take advantage of it.
Yeah. Was there anything in the writing of Find You in the Dark that surprised you as a writer?
It was when I did my last draft, which is, I'll let you behind the curtain here. His daughter wasn't a part of this story until the very last draft I did of it, because I realized there just wasn't enough quite at stake for him. If it was all he had to lose was a marriage and a stable, normal life. I was surprised, because as someone who's, not necessarily that interested in having children of my own, I was surprised that the most important relationship in the first novel I wrote was a father-daughter relationship. Because I think it's the purest and most important relationship in that book. And it's what makes the reader, kind of, no matter how weird Martin gets, that's a part that you never question as being pure. And it ended up being so important to the life of the book, I think. Without that thread, his character doesn't make sense, and the story just becomes a little too unappealing.
Well, that brings up a great point that, some people, when they give writing advice, tell you to write what you know, and that can be interpreted a lot of different ways, but most people interpret that quite literally. And you do not have a daughter, as you said, yet you were able to bring out this really compelling thread there. So maybe the best writing advice is don't listen to other people's writing advice. And
Yes.
but yeah, was that a difficult thing for you to tune into, or did that just come naturally to you as a writer?
I think because it really does ultimately kind of fit into write what you know. Like, I don't know about the everyday struggles of parenting, but I know middle-aged men, and I know young women. I know fathers, and I know daughters. I've known them as individuals, and I think once you commit to like learning a lot about people around you, it becomes easier to imagine yourself into those relationships like that, and into those people. It's a matter. I mean, there's huge debates up on this side of the border, and probably on your side, about cultural appropriation, whether it's appropriate for like a white person to write a black protagonist and stuff. I think these conversations are almost too fraught to have at this particular moment, but I think almost all of them come down to like you have to be willing to really think about the person and the relationship you're writing, and not just about what your imagination of that person is, and not just about an aspect of their pain that you want to explore. You actually have to do the imagination and real life research work to get into that person. And I think it is possible in almost any case. Like, I think that's how fiction exists and why it has such an important place in like building empathy and relationships and understandings of each other's consciousness.
Well, and fiction ought to be the place where we can dig into things that are hard to talk about, or maybe break down taboos and things like that. So while I understand the argument, it makes me a little sad when we start telling people what they can and cannot talk about. Not to put too fine a point on it, but fiction ought to be this kind of dangerous frontier, as long as we're doing it respectfully.
I agree with that completely. Yes. Yeah.
So this, you talked about, the discovery process of the book. Are you do you consider yourself a discovery writer from beginning to end? Do you outline at any point? Kind of what's your writing process like?
I think discovery is too glamorous a word to put on it. I'm a real stumbler. Like I tend to
not even a pantser.
Exactly. I'll arrive at like parts in the story where I'm absolutely sure I know what I'm doing and write 2,000 words that will end up in the final draft, but have very little idea where my protagonist is going in the next scene. And I think that works up to a certain page, and then at that point, if you don't want to have first draft that's a total disaster, you have to sort of dial down the discovery aspect and force yourself to, if not build an outline, envision at least what's going to happen at the end, more or less, and then the next couple of steps after the scene that you're writing right now. I still need to have that sort of muddy vagueness in the middle of a project, or else I lose interest in it. But I mean, I also write screenplays, and in those cases, I co-write them with a guy named Chris Burton, another writer. And we do really severe, rigid outlines. And I think maybe the surprise aspect of writing like that comes in your conversations over what the story should be. So I think outlines can be useful, but I just can't use them when I'm writing alone.
Yeah. I totally get that. The book Find You in the Dark, it's out now when people are hearing this. This is one of the best psychological thrillers I think I've read in quite a long time, Nathan. It keeps the adrenaline ratcheted up all the way through the end. How satisfying was it for you when you got to the end and you realized that you had tied the story up and that it was going to be a real live thing?
I was pretty happy with it. Again, you do kind of have those moments of defeat, like I talked about when I was discussing Bradbury's The Lake there. I'm like, well, this is I did it. I did what I set out to do, but is it going to work? But yeah, I think especially with this novel where a lot of the circumstances get tied up at the end, but psychologically we're left with a ton of questions.
Right.
It was a particularly satisfying book to get to in that way because I won't tell you who lives or dies in the book, of course, but there's a sense of real resolution for at least one of the characters, but definitely not for a lot of the others. Go ahead.
Well, when the reader at the end is left feeling satisfied and unsettled at the same time, I think you've done your job well.
Thank you. That's what I aim for, and I think I will in every book, really.
Yeah. So what are you working on now? This book is out now. So does that mean you have another one that's in the works?
Yeah, that's right. I have a deadline on it this month. I'm getting there. It's another thriller, another psychological thriller. It's a standalone. Kind of dips a toe into the world of cults, but in a real aftermath way. And it's about someone who's haunted by a dark past handed to them by their parents who they never wanted anything to do with. And then similar to Finding the Dark, she realizes the past isn't quite the past yet when somebody else related to this whole situation from her past is found dead.
Oh, I cannot wait to read that. That's going to be amazing. Are you working on anything as Nathan Ruthman, as your other writing persona?
Nothing. Well, I mean, it's weird because even though the screenplay stuff I work on is definitely in genre world, so far I just used Nathan Ruthman for that. It's a very confused existence. So I've been doing a lot of screenwriting stuff, but I think it's after this second thriller. I'm gonna write a short literary novel, and that'll be the then sort of step forward. I'm always writing short stories. I find those are really important, and I think precisely because they have no real commercial purpose. That's where like my very pure creative, like totally untroubled by anything outside of me and the words happens. So those are important. I always write short stories.
Yeah, I love that that's still part of your repertoire. That you keep those skills, those tools sharp. I love that. Yeah. Nathan, do you have a website where people can find you, or are you on social media if they are intrigued by you and your story and want to find out more about what you do?
Yeah, I have a really terrible bare bones website at nathanripley.com. I do most of my online activities at Twitter. So if you just search for Nathan Ruthman, Nathan Ripley on Twitter, you'll find it. The actual handle is @Nathan Ruthman.
Gotcha. And we'll put links to all that in the show notes to help people find you. And there's a link to the book, Find You in the Dark. It comes highly recommended. Thank you so much for your time today, Nathan. And we wish you much success on the book launch.
Thanks for a great interview, Hank. It was great talking to you.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was walking through the woods between Wolfert's Roost and the future site of my father's Stone Manor house. The house would eventually stand on what had been old Baltus's pumpkin field, the land where I had found my grandfather's head. Father had chosen the spot for its view of the Hudson River. Knoll was to be a grand mansion in the Gothic Revival style, but at the time the mansion was but a few foundations of Van Brunt stone. I had become fond of the place already, the idea of it, and I spent many a night alone in a shack on the property. My mother disapproved. She would have me sleep in the room across from hers in our townhouse. But I was 15 and did not answer to her. I kept a bottle of spirits hidden in the crook of 2 walnut trees near old Baltus's grave. I thought he would approve of the gesture. I had stopped along my way to fetch it out. At the moment the first pull of liquor touched my throat, I heard a ghastly, inhuman laugh. I was not alone in the woods. Had God sent the horseman after me? Had I sinned that terribly? I ran through the wood and found the field where Knoll was to be built. The outline of the foundations was barely discernible beneath the snow. An apparition stood there. Though I have seen him many times since, I shall never forget my first glimpse. Gaunt in moonlight, headless, exuding power and malice. A magic thing in the land of the ordinary. The headless horseman of Sleepy Hollow. What chills those words evoke! It charged at me, hatchet raised. I stood transfixed, unable to move, unable to even imagine escape. This was the servant of God, after all, sent to strike down sinners. I hurled the bottle from my hand, ashamed that I had become a drunkard as Baltus had been. It shattered against the foundations of Knoll. I stretched out my arms and awaited judgment. A piercing white light broke the darkness. The horse reared. "Not my Dylan!" cried Agatha, appearing from the wood. She held a skull in her hand. It shone brightly as a diamond, and in that moment I understood. The horseman did not serve God. He served my grandmother. Perhaps in that moment I came to see Agatha and God as one and the same. The unholy spirit fought her command. A foreleg of the demon horse struck my head with such power that I fell backwards with a cry and knew no more. I carry the scar to this day. A slight indentation in my temple, barely noticeable. In my days of courting I was told that when I am angry the patch of insulted skull bone will stand out in a disturbing manner. I have never had occasion to see this phenomenon, however, as I am generally well pleased whenever I pass a mirror.